Thanks. So like Tim said, I'm an associate at Cherry C. Reams Architects. We just started a fabrication component, which is called Factor M. In Latin, that means maker. We're starting to do that to try and integrate the idea of designing something and building it. We like to try and build with the same care that we design with. And I'll show you some of the projects that we've done that on. I did my undergraduate studies here, graduated in 2005, and then I went to SciArc in Los Angeles, graduated in 2009, bounced around from firm to firm, a little bit out there, a little bit back here. I worked at Emergent with Tom Wiscombe while I was out there, and then got a job back here at Cherry C. Reams, where I'm now an associate, and also I've been teaching at UNM for about 6 years. And I see some familiar faces out there. All right, so let's so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've done that's kind of on the periphery of architecture. I think towards the end of the slides, I'll get into a little bit of the architecture. But I wanted to think about how to frame this in the context of this class and the idea of design thinking. And so that made me start to kind of ask myself, to me, what is design? Is it the process? Is it critical thinking? Or the idea of problem solving? I like to think that it's problem solving, but not just problem solving. This isn't me. This is not my work. So problem solving, I think, is kind of an isolated thing. You take a problem, and there's a way to correct that problem, and all you're doing is creating a function, and you're looking at it from a singular perspective. You're not moving forward with it at all. So instead of just addressing the problem, I think that design is when you can actually find an opportunity. So if a problem or a constraint or something comes up, if you can find opportunity in that and find some way to celebrate the idea of form in that. So rather than just looking at function, you also have to introduce the idea of form, and I'm sure in some of your classes you've heard of form and function. But really, I think that's where the idea of design comes from, in my mind, and design thinking. So just to dive into some of the projects that I've done, this is just a generic idea of what we all know Stemware is. Our parents have them, their parents have them, or our parents own our grandparents' Stemware. It's passed down generation to generation. Some of them are very, very stylized, others are not. But there's a line of Stemware. This is a line that I've created. It's called Frou Frou. And what I've done is tried to separate the idea of ornament and function. And so instead of having crystal stemware that's got stamped patterns, this actually isolates the glass from the design of the handle and the stemware, and it becomes interchangeable. So really trying to create a line that has a cohesive language through it, and also would allow it to be interchangeable pieces, separating and discussing the idea of form and function kind of on the periphery of architecture. I had worked on doing a couple lines of this, prototyped them. So these are some of the renderings of it. And then here we get into each of the pieces, the identity of each piece, and what I'm focusing on. And then also I prototyped one of each of them. And I was thinking about taking it to Kickstarter or something like that, and I just got busy with some other projects, and so that one kind of took a back burner and hasn't really developed much from there. But I think there's a common thread in a lot of the work that I'm working on that stays true to that. Another project that I had worked on that I was commissioned to do was a dining table. And instead of just thinking about a dining table the way that tables are thought of traditionally, like what you see here, I wanted to introduce a little bit of a different feel to it. So in working on that, I had built a ribbon that went across the ceiling, down the wall, and then folded out as a table. I ended up having to cut the wall open and weld up a moment frame inside of that so that it could cantilever and hold any load that would go on it. Before I turned it over, I actually stood on the table just to make sure and to illustrate to the client that, that it would hold. So this is one of the approaches to a traditional problem that I like to look at. Another problem, this one I did fairly recently. It's not fully completed, but I had enough to at least generate a couple images for you guys, was the idea of pendant lighting. Right now, we're trying to overhaul our architecture office with a lot of furnishings and fixtures that we've designed and created. And so for the pendant light that I did, I worked with a lighting rep, and they provided me some LED lights. We had gone through a bunch of samples and finally found one that was very, very small and could work well with a housing that we designed. And then so here are a couple just photographs of that. It's still a little bit crude. This is a 3D printed housing that I had modeled in Maya and then 3D printed here. And I've got some tweaks, but that's the first prototype of where that's going. Another commission that I had recently received was, there's a local brewery here, and it's Dialog Brewing. I don't know if any of you know of it. They wanted to generate tap handles that were of the same language that the rest of the brewery is. And you know, they've got a very unique identity in the way that they present themselves with cold steel, birch, plywood, and just raw and true to the materials. So rather than just providing a tap handle that's the standard off-the-shelf default tap handle, I went ahead and designed and fabricated 45 tap handles for them, like you see here. I also ended up getting a contract with them to follow up on some other products that they had worked on, but I'm not showing that in the slide here. So that's me. Don't focus on me, but that was me before architecture school. I guess 200 was real rough for me, but this slide is to introduce the idea of sunglasses. And in looking for an introduction slide for sunglasses, I wasn't able to find anything that was very unstylized. Sunglasses by nature are stylized to accentuate the face and become an accessory. So instead of doing that, I just went ahead and showed this. But here's a set of sunglasses that I had designed, really around the idea of customizability and mass production, and also the ability to customize and interchange pieces so that you have a unique style to your own set of sunglasses. I had modeled these, rendered it, and then on the right-hand side there, you can see that's actually the prototype of the sunglasses. In looking at trying to patent something like this, I had kind of gone down a few avenues and started to realize very quickly that when you get into the realm of eyewear, there's a lot of risk involved because you're dealing with something so close to people's eyes. And so that's about where this one ended. It just kind of stayed with the prototype there. And I want to mention, if you guys have any questions or comments on any of these projects, I'd like to have conversation about it. It's not necessarily just me talking about my projects. If you want to ask questions about them or want to know how I did something or what programs I used or anything like that, feel free to ask. So another project that I had worked on was a bookshelf. And this one was kind of nice because what I had done was taken the idea of a bookshelf. I had measured exactly where it needed to go for the client that I was working with. And I was able to come up with a system that not only works pretty well in that area, but also is reconfigurable, and the size and configuration of it can be reduced or enlarged based on the need of the user. Here's an image of the bookshelf just as it was getting a test fit. I had then gone on and put a finish on it, and it's full of books now and everything. And then on the right-hand side, you can see there's a Rhino screenshot of the digital model. And so when I worked on this project, I went in and actually modeled the entire context that it was going to go. The client already knew where that bookshelf needed to be, and so I was able to measure it and get it. You can see it gets pretty close to the ceiling up top there, and that's what they wanted. So all of the pieces that you see on the bookshelf are actually interlocking boxes. It's not faux in any way. Each of those boxes was actually assembled as a box, and then as they notch together, it gains rigidity, and then when you lock the final piece in, the rest of them don't separate. Another project that I had worked on, this was during my thesis when I was in grad school. I was very busy with doing a lot of the research, writing the papers, and working on the architecture during thesis. And so on the side, I actually had just a project that I was working on. There was a competition brief that I had found online, and I took that and ran with it and just kind of did my own project on a supercar. And that was one way for me to give myself a mental break from what I was doing in thesis. So, you know, I'd work long hours. When I'd find myself getting burnt out, I actually used it as kind of an outlet to just kind of express what I wanted to do and kind of free myself in terms of designing without overthinking. So here we have a car, and then here's the car that I had designed while I was doing that. I haven't prototyped that one yet. It's still just a rendering. So I've talked a little bit about some of the tools that I've used on some of these projects. I've used Rhino for many of them. I've used Maya for many of them. ZBrush, you name it. The list goes on and on for all of the programs that I've used. But what I think is interesting is that there's a cross-platform for tools now. And if you're a jewelry designer, or if you're an architecture major, or an architect, or automotive designer, or product designer, industrial designer, anything like that, the tool palette that we all use is very similar. And it was kind of funny when I was in grad school, the school went down and we visited the Audi Design Center, and we talked to them for a little while, and they showed us through their computer labs and everything that they were working on. They had some projects that they couldn't show us, but they kind of took us around, kind of showed us what they were working on. And while we were there, we asked, you know, do you guys ever hire architecture students? Because we saw that they were using the same tools that we were using. They were modeling in the same programs. They were rendering the same way. They were 3D printing to test things. And they just stepped back and kind of in an ignorant way said, no, we don't have any need for architecture. And so they didn't really recognize that we're on the same platform as them. They still saw us as 2x4s and sloped roofs and didn't really understand how we address design and how we address problems. So I think that in architecture school, you get a better understanding of the rest of the design field than any other specific design field. You know, people that are doing jewelry design, I don't know that they're as aware of the other design fields like we are. So I think we're at a pretty privileged vantage point there as far as just being able to recognize that. And I think you guys all know that. You know, we have to dive into some very specific topics in each of your classes, so we kind of have to learn a lot about everything. So here's another image of that. So this is just a little project that I had done around the house. It was kind of like the drill on a blender kind of thing. So I have a little piece of bamboo that was growing pretty tall and starting to lean. And rather than just finding one of these from Home Depot or some kind of stick and sticking it in and actually just solving the problem, I wanted to look at it and see, is this an opportunity for design? And is there a way that I can actually enhance how the plant is in the living room and how it's contributing to the rest of the space? And so here's the stilt for the plant. And then here I welded up a triangulated frame to allow the plant to grow on the lattice. So even just at a small level, some of the small problem-solving projects that you can come up with, there is a way to embed it with the idea of design and not just solve a problem. A few years ago, I had designed and donated a vase to the university for their Lobo living room. They had an auction, and they had auctioned it off, and I think it did pretty well. But here we have a vase, the kind of standard vase that most of us would see in our parents' cupboard or grandparents' cupboard. And then here we have the vase that I had come up with. And it becomes an interlocking set. And I had also, after this, I never rendered it out, but modified the system to have multiple sizes that interlock. So you could buy one of piece A, one of piece B, or one of piece C, D, and E, and they all fit, and you get a different configuration. So rather than just finding something to put flowers in, how do you see that as an opportunity to do something more? So here we have just a very standard bicycle. A couple years ago, a few friends of mine and I got together and we worked on a competition, and we actually won the competition. It was for a new innovative design for a bicycle. So here we have just one of the renderings of that bicycle. It's the InSauk bicycle, and what we had done was looked at how we can actually rethink the idea and aesthetic of bicycle. That a lot of the aesthetics were just to kind of create wow factor, not necessarily so functional. It does function. We even did some ergonomic tests to make sure that everything was located correctly. But really what we were looking at was how can we take the friction of the wheels while they're spinning and use that to generate power to power your iPhone, to power headlights, to power brake lights, and then also to provide a self-assist system for the bicycle. So on this slide, you can see on the right, there are 3 modes of operation. One is just manual, where you're pedaling, and that's actually generating power. There's a hybrid where it's actually assisting you while you're climbing hills. And then there's a third when you're charging the battery or when you're just using the power. So these are some of the boards that were submitted. On the left, we have just kind of the wow images. And then on the right, basically we've diagrammed and set up charts in the way that we saw the problem and what we were trying to solve. So instead of just designing a bicycle, we started looking at numbers in terms of public transit, in terms of just global warming and those kinds of things, and how we could actually contribute to larger conversations of a lot of that stuff. We've also got some diagrams of how the powering works, and then a personalization or customization diagram showing how each rider and each user could actually customize the bike to be what they want it to be. After we won the competition, it got huge publicity. It was pretty well received by a lot of online blogs and magazines. So we got published in a handful of magazines and tens of, dozens of online blogs. So what we wanted to do was stay with that momentum. I went ahead and fabricated a prototype of the bike frame. And we had a friend in Los Angeles that had a gallery that was kind of closely related to the topic of bicycles and global warming and just trying to do something better. And so we sent this off. I haven't seen it since it's been painted, but I hear that, or maybe it's not even painted yet, I'm not totally sure. But they're working on trying to get that in the gallery. So I CNC'd the frame out of MDF. That was just to give me a mold. I then went and vacuum formed it to give a harder shell, and then inlaid some carbon fiber as the composite. And so you can see on the right here, here's where I've inlaid the carbon fiber. This is a high density foam that I pressed in to give it a little more rigidity. And then it was a two-sided piece that seamed and came together. And you can see it over here. We also milled out of aluminum the headlights and some of the smaller details. And then also CNC'd the polycarbonate seat. Another project that I was commissioned for, another small one, was a wedding altar. And the client didn't really want the traditional wedding altar like what you would see here. They wanted something that had a little bit more of a contemporary feel. They liked the idea of asymmetry, which we all love asymmetry, so it was a great client to work with. And so I went ahead and designed and fabricated a contemporary wedding altar. It was cut out of plywood and then faced with dye bond. Each of the pieces was just out of a two-dimensional sheet, and then it waffled together and held together. And then the two pieces actually interlock up at the top. So assembling it took maybe 10 minutes on site. That then went on, from what I've heard, they sold the altar to another couple, and I think they signed underneath it. And I haven't tracked it, but I think it, for a little while, was at least traveling around. Another project that I had worked on, and this was one because I had seen the need for a tool. And so this wasn't commissioned by anyone. This was just me trying to solve a problem that I had. And what that came a lot from CNCing three-dimensional topographies and three-dimensional models. It's an incredible amount of waste when it comes to the material. And so I started trying to think about it a little bit more freely, as far as how can we create multiple types of mold without actually creating waste. And I started looking at actuators and pneumatics and tried to come up with a way that I could program through Grasshopper a surface that would then control a set of arms with feet on them, and then a tessellated surface above that you could then vacuum form and then mold around. Another option that I had while I was working through it was stamping metal. If you could do something like this as the positive and then bring in a negative of the same surface, you could stamp metal, and you could do infinite amount of custom panels with very little waste. So this never really went anywhere. I investigated it probably for about 6 or 8 months after the initial design came up, and I had done some smaller prototypes. They were non-photogenic and not real well executed, so they didn't make it into the slides. But and then just kind of dropped that idea. Yeah. Artwork. So I've done a lot of art, either for friends, auctions, art galleries, donations, various things. And my artwork's a little bit different than Bob Ross. I like to work digitally, I like to fabricate, and I like to create a combination of the two. Where I really see projects that get exciting is when it gets down to the details, and when there's an articulation and a level of craft that's beyond what you would expect from any given material. So on these are all each about 16 inches by 8 or 10 inches, roughly around there. You can see the plywood pattern in the back for scale. But I had tried to start to distort the idea of materiality, and also think about what can metal do, and at what scale does it start to become what we would think impossible. And so I've got a couple pieces here that have steel that's rusted and articulated in a way that you wouldn't actually expect steel to do. So this one here, I think I called it Datum. It's got a plate of steel that's rusting up above on the top, and then at the end there it actually starts to fold and become sort of, I don't know, Spider-Man 3 or something like that. Yeah, so up at the top in the middle there, That's walnut and rusted steel. And trying to see how those two can actually, even though they're such dissimilar materials, through rusting and color and finish, how can they start to appear similar and formally do what you wouldn't expect out of a material.
Steve, go back. Just quick question. How are you executing that? Like, what tools are you using to create those?
That's a good question. So, in terms of modeling or fabricating?
Fabrication.
Okay. There are a couple techniques that I would rather not say.
Okay.
Yeah, but basically, you break it up into elements, and it's kind of a dumb way to think about it, I think. But really, if we think about this, even on this one, I've kind of isolated areas and use different techniques on each of those areas to be able to accomplish the geometry. So it's not just one piece of steel that ends up gnarling and becoming something else. It's broken into multiple pieces and then brought together. And then whether it's welded and then actually hand finished, or some of it was plasma cut and then welded and folded and rusted.
Is it mostly haptic, or is there any digital?
No, it's all digital.
It's all digital.
Yeah. I have digital models of each of these. Yeah. I think where the haptic nature comes in is how the finish takes, and controlling how it rusts. Yeah.
I was wondering do you have like a good ratio, or do you have a ratio between like bound materials or something you actually go out and buy, or is it really dependent on the project? Or
Those are all bought.
Those are all bought?
Yeah, and it all came as primitive material.
Oh, okay.
None of it was.
That's what I was wondering, if you ever use like bound material, like a piece of plywood, and try to refigure that into something.
I've done that, but I don't know. My body of work doesn't seem to include that a whole lot.
Okay.
Not for any.
Because you were bringing in like these rusted metals, I was like,
Yeah.
I wonder if you went to a scrapyard
Nope.
and just found some.
They were brand new metals with stickers on them.
Oh, okay.
And I took it to this level. I could see how you would ask that, how potentially some of it could look like a handlebar from a bike or something like that, but no, it's all primitive material that's manipulated.
Okay.
It's interesting because I think that when you look at this work, it's very different from the previous work, but the methodology is the same.
Yeah.
But maybe that's the interesting thing about it, is that it has this very sort of handmade quality to it.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a dialogue that isn't really represented quite.
That's what I really wanted to kind of exploit here, and I think we've all probably been a victim of it, but there's the idea that the old craftsman does not respect the new digital age. And if you present something and it's digital, or the output has been somewhat digital, they think it's push a button and you get what you get. And I think anyone here that's worked on any project in any of the studios you're in, that's not the case. There's a lot of craft, there's a lot of thought that goes into the digital model in order to be able to output it, and then there's a huge level of handcraft that has to bring it all together nicely. And so this was actually kind of my way of critiquing and combating that kind of critique. So I'm hoping that a lot more of my work kind of starts to move this direction. This one's a little bit newer than some of the other stuff. This was another piece that I had worked on and donated to the AIA for one of their auctions. Just CNC plasma cut steel, CNC milled the wood. It's walnut and steel, and then just interlocked everything to create just a nice little composition. There was a competition at one of the architecture schools in Texas a few years ago, and a friend of mine and I got together to design a piece of art. It was art by architects. And so what we had done was we tried to critique the idea of 2D representation and 3D representation, not as standalone things, but how can you start to bring it together. We also started to try and address the idea of object on podium, and where does the art start and end, rather than having a podium become part of the context and the art is something that sits on it. How how do we blur that boundary, and how do we blur the boundary of 2D and 3D? And so what we had done was digitally modeled this piece here, which then kind of embeds itself down into the podium, and you can even see down at the bottom kind of creates a ripple. And then every piece that's inside of the podium is actually represented two-dimensionally, graphically on that podium to kind of distort the 2D, 3D idea. They selected this for the show. They were then very insulting, and it was, we kind of butted heads on this one, and so we just backed out, and we didn't end up following through with it. This is just a piece of art. Here's another piece similar to that last one that I modeled. Again, modeled in Maya, rendered in Mental Ray, and then taken from there. I then printed this. I did a combination of print and hand ink on acrylic, and then paired that with steel, and then donated that to an auction where it sold. This section is just like odds and ends. I have some projects that I wasn't really sure what to say about, but wanted to kind of show a little bit of range. Some of it is just digital sketch. So, instead of just sketching on napkins, like if you see up at the top here, that's me working through ideas digitally, not really knowing what the end result's going to be, but starting to use that and sculpt and sketch in that way. There was another infrastructural competition that I had worked on where it was the idea of transportation and parking lots, basically, the square footage of parking lots and how much that takes up, and also the aesthetic of parking lots and what we can do to try and eliminate that idea. And so I had come up with a mode of transportation that I looked at how it would fold up, and then I had some other diagrams where I would show that this would actually cling and then latch onto the facade of a building. So as you ride these, as you park at a building, they start to populate the building, changing the facade and eliminating the need for a parking lot. There are, let's see, a couple knives. I worked with a local knife designer. He wanted to patent an idea that he had for a knife. So he went and took it. So I worked with him. We detailed it, got it all working, and then he took that idea to a larger knife company. And I think they're still in negotiations about whether or not that's something they're interested in. Down at the bottom here, I worked with one of the other faculty members here fairly recently on a TextFab competition entry. We submitted this. It was a small installation that we were going to fabricate out of steel. It wasn't selected, though. And then just some other stuff. More digital sketches on the side here, looking at building facade, openings, and identity on building facade, and how you deal with that. Also kind of looking at the idea of joinery, not only as a pattern that is secondary to the form, but how does that pattern start to distort the form and actually gain identity in that way. I think joinery and craftsmanship and materials and just how it all comes together is kind of prevalent in a lot of my work. And then a couple competitions that I had submitted on a few years ago that didn't do so well. So the main reason I include some of those is just kind of to illustrate the point, don't let failure get you down, because there is going to be a lot of failure. You're going to try and try and try a lot, and hopefully you don't fail as many times as I have, but it's going to be there, and you can't let that get you down. You need to find out how to learn from that and how to develop your own tool set in a way that you can come back better next time and design and understand the problem a little bit better. And then this is just a little bit of the work, just a couple images of some of the buildings and stuff that we've done in the firm since I've been there. We've got a couple just detail shots of some of the buildings where We had done some rusted Core 10 steel on a library. We also did some custom perforation on the other side of the library, and I worked with the steel manufacturer to get the patterns all taken care of. On one of the schools we worked on, they needed a mechanical yard, and initially it was just going to be all of the mechanical units on the ground behind a CMU wall. And we tried to look at that and address it a little bit more thoughtfully and say, why does a mechanical yard have to be an ugly piece of a building? Why can't this be some kind of highlight? And so what we did was we came up with a double-decker mechanical yard that has units on the bottom floor, units on the top floor, and then an access ladder inside, also with a hoist up top so you could drop the units down if you have to interchange them. And it became kind of a nice, I wish I had an overall of the building here, but it became kind of a nice gem on the side of the facade of the building. So just seeing that as opportunity right there. And then a shade structure that we recently completed on the right there. And those are perforated panels, the white panels. And then they also, I think you can see a little bit right here. The upper panel has text cut through it. It's plasma cut through that. And then it actually, in certain months, it comes down and you can read and see some words on the grass. A lot of kids sit and read under the shade structure. It's at one of the libraries. And then Tim had mentioned Factor M. We're starting to ramp up. We do a lot of design, fabrication. Also, we work with other firms that are doing design, and we're trying to aid them in the fabrication of any small component. And you can see that in some of the light fixtures or anything like that. But really, just trying to take the idea of the attention to detail that we as designers approach a problem, and then also carry that through the manufacturing and fabrication of it in a way that you can enhance any project with that detail. So these are a couple, I think two restaurants, a sign that we had done, and then there's a display that we're doing for the Veterans Memorial right now that we're fabricating currently. That's why that's just a line drawing. That's it. Any questions?
Let's give him a hand. Questions? I have a lot. Come on, that stuff was inspiring.
Yeah.
So what's your preferred system to render everything? Do you like to use like Grasshopper or Rhino or Revit?
That's actually a great question. So I think the best thing to do is understand each of those as a tool. And Rhino, for architectural models, Rhino's great, especially if you're trying to explore design. You're very free in the way that you work. If you're trying to do some kind of patterning or iteration and you need the strength of parametrics, then Grasshopper, especially if you want to create multiple iterations of something without having to do the legwork of every step along the way. In the office, we use Revit, which is a building information modeling tool. That's not great for school or for free design because you have to know a lot about each piece before you even design. So you need to know what the wall is, what it's made of, what the insulation is, what the thickness is, before you can even lay it down. So you can't really sculpt a project or space. And then as far as rendering goes, I like Mental Ray. It's a pretty robust rendering system, but for when I teach V-Ray because it's got a very short learning curve. So within usually a half hour or an hour or 2 sessions even, students can usually render fairly decently very quickly. So I think it's all about just knowing what each one can do and then figuring out what's the best tool for the job. I also think that thinking about software like that it gives you a little bit longer shelf life in terms of expiring. If you only think of one tool and that's your go-to, that tool's not going to be it forever. And so if you understand how that one fits within the discourse of software, then you have an understanding of different software, and when new ones come out, oh, it's very similar, it's just a different platform or whatever. So, did that answer your question? Okay. Yeah.
Do you get a lot of jobs from like patent holders and stuff besides the knife?
I wish. No. I guess I haven't been able to find a venue where to get in touch with a lot of them. I know that there have been classes held at UNM in the past that I've been a part of, and we've had people from the business school come over and critique projects, and they're blown away by the ingenuity and design and aesthetics and everything that we can come up with here. And they have no problem with the idea of patents and understanding that portion, but when it comes to solving a problem, they don't know how to do it. So for a little while, there was some conversation about trying to see how we could, I wanted to get kind of a cross-disciplinary class that could work with that. That never really turned into anything, but other than that, I'm not plugged in enough to even know where to go to display these skills to get that kind of client. Yeah.
I'm just curious, what's written in the perforated steel? Is it perforated steel?
Yes. Yeah. I think it says read, play, write, learn. The library system that we had worked with has a message that, you know, they've got their objectives and they've got their mission statement and everything like that, and that fell within what they were interested in. So that was kind of out of our hands as far as determining what to write. They had to run it through their legal team and everything, and so that was kind of just given to us. But since they have kids out there reading and everything like that, I guess they've, through their studies, have thought, you know, read, learn, write, and play are different ways that kids learn. And that happens sometimes. I didn't show any. I have projects that I'm not proud of. I think the craft and the steel works great, but the client had a design and they didn't want to budge on that, and so sometimes I fabricate it. I think the details turn out great, but the overall aesthetic of the piece is not something that I'm going to show as what I want to show my work like. Any other questions?
I have two. There's one right here.
Yeah.
With an architectural background, is it difficult to shift into like product design or working for automotive, motorcycle finishes, those things?
I think it's easier to go that way than to come this way. I do think that there's a very esoteric understanding of the problems that they're solving in any industry. And so the shift is a difficult one, and you would have to present your case in a way that they could see the strengths that would allow you to solve their problems. But I think it's easier to take an architectural background and go to any other design field versus coming into architecture. Oh, sorry.
Do you compete in like design competitions online where it's like public domain?
Yeah.
Or is it like, I know some of them, some competitions you have to pay for to enter and stuff.
Yeah.
But what kind of free ones, like online, do you use?
I've got a handful of web pages that I've tagged in my browser that I continually look at and update to try and see. I do some paid for, I do some free. There are invited competitions that I've not been a part of yet, but hopefully as work gets out there, you become on someone's radar so that they'll invite you to those competitions. I can send Tim a list of the kind of standard pages that I browse for competitions, and he can distribute that to you guys if you want that.
Yeah.
Okay.
We put it on our website.
Yeah.
Do you think it's possible to change this idea the architect is not a good designer?
I don't know. That's tough. You know, if you look at any well-renowned architect, they've, for the longest time, been designing chairs and furniture and lamps and anything like that. And I don't know what it is that's in the education that others are getting that doesn't allow them to see the versatility of our education and what we do. Yeah. I think all we can do is continue to do this cross-disciplinary development and start to try and solve these types of problems throughout and slowly gain recognition that way. But I don't think it is up to any one person to be able to change that. I think it's just the more we continue to push that and the more the tools continue to blend and everything.
I think that's my question, is that, you know, when I was in school, there was a bunch of my colleagues that left architecture, or they did hybrid practices. So they were doing product design and architecture, and it was really whatever came in the door, right? And I think like your generation is definitely doing that. I don't think it happens here in Albuquerque a lot. I think it's due to the economy.
Yeah.
Like, you know, like there's just really, it doesn't have the spectrum that New York and LA have. But I think we'll see it more. And so the question, I think it comes back to answering that question, is really how one markets themselves.
Yeah.
And you know, and I think that the notion of being an architect has a certain level of prestige, but also has a level of limits, right? And I think if you market yourself as a designer, then you have the ability to market in multiple ways. And so for me, I think it's about promotion and marketing. So maybe the questions I have is, one, do you promote your work outside of Cherry Reams, C Reams, in a website or anything like that?
I don't. Not yet. Yeah. I had dabbled with that and thought about opening up a couple venues to try and promote the work, and then the opportunity came that I could actually found Factor M and do that. And you know, in some of the early conversation that we had about that, it was like, well, are we designing and then fabricating, or are we allowing others to design and then we fabricate? And does it have to be architectural, or can it be product, or can it be any of these other things? And so I think when that conversation came up, we were very quick to not exclude any option as far as that goes. So right there, I saw an opportunity to then take a lot of, you know, my work and start to try and promote it through Factor M, because I think if I promote my work elsewhere, it just causes more work for me, I guess.
Sure. Well, and then the second part is that, you know, like the work's beautiful.
Thank you.
Like it's really nice. And but I guess when you approach a problem, how do you approach it? You know, and maybe it's really in the methodology. Like, do you sketch things out? Do you go through precedent research? Is it all of the above? You know, how do you approach a problem?
Both of those. I'm very quick to sketch. You know, I think we're kind of trained as designers to, the minute you hear a problem, you are already formulating a solution. And so the minute I'm starting to think about a problem, I'm already getting ideas. And a lot of times it's jumbled, and it's little parts and pieces of a lot of different ideas. And so sketching is the first way that I can actually isolate those ideas and compartmentalize those to see what I'm trying to accomplish with each of them. I know that I've had conversations with other architects, and they, you know, in one of the reviews, they asked someone, they're like, how do you know what the first mark is that you put on the paper? And really, I think that kind of fetishizes one thing, that first mark, as if it's something amazing, when iteration is the way to go. Design and working through iteratively, and not fetishizing that first mark, but understanding that that's going to change and it's going to develop. But I'll also look at precedent studies, especially if it's something that's maybe a little bit outside of the realm of what I've dealt with before. You try and educate yourself the best way you can, not to learn every lesson that someone else has already learned. So instead of coming into a design problem with any one of these different topics and saying, well, I'm gonna tackle stemware or bicycle, and you don't want to learn the same issue or the same lesson that the first guy that did bicycle worked through. So you have to look at precedents, you have to look and do your research to try and figure out what the conversation is in that area, and then also try and educate yourself to almost be a master of what you're working on so that you can then carry it forward. Yeah?
I'm a little confused. Are you saying you look at the precedent studies so you don't have to reinvent the wheel, or you're looking at precedent studies so that when you're looking at the problem, you don't get stuck into the same mindset people who've already been designing it are stuck in? That way you can have a fresh view on the problem?
I think the first. I like to look at precedent studies so I am not reinventing a wheel. I think that, as architecture students and designers, and jumping from design field to design field is great because you are approaching different problems with fresh eyes. So, it's like if an automotive designer were to come in here and try and solve one of the design problems for studio, I think they would approach it a lot differently than the students here do, and that could be a fresh idea or a fresh conversation. And so I try to look at it in a way that I'm not reinventing the wheel, but also not to where you start to fall into the trends and patterns that you see in a way that you can't break free of that to create something new. And I guess there is nothing new. We all know that.
I think one of the questions I also have is like, we talk about 3D printing, and I use a lot of 3D printing in my work, but it's not something that is really incorporated very much in the school
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah.
We do have a lot of 3D printers, and you see the occasional one come out, but as an iterative process, how integrated do you use in the way that you work?
Pretty regularly, yeah. And I'm not sure why it's not that prevalent in a lot of the studio work here.
I think it's cost.
I think so too,
Yeah.
Surprisingly, yeah. I think if anyone who has thought to 3D print here, I've worked with Chris Stewart in the computer lab pretty extensively recently to try and figure out what the best way to get the cost down is. And I think we're at like $1 a cubic inch, which is very affordable. So I think there's the idea of the expense. But really, a lot of the students that I worked with in the advanced fab class that did those towers, and then in my studio, are starting to realize that the cost is not as much as the rumor has it.
It's also pedagogy. Like, I think a lot of faculty aren't comfortable with it.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
you have to be able to understand it to get your students to engage it. And
Yeah.
so there's
Yeah.
not very many faculty that have really incorporated it in the way that they work.
Exactly. Yeah, it's curriculum and pedagogy. I think, and the ability to understand some of the more radical forms and critique them at a high level. I don't know what the percentage would be, but if I showed this to a lot of the faculty, they'd think I just do blobby stuff.
Right. Right.
So, but once you get into the formal nature of some of this stuff, then you really start to see a lot of the detail and a lot of the esoterics of how you're accomplishing something, and you really kind of read a certain language that maybe some can't actually catch.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? What about collaboration? How does collaboration change the way that you operate? Because I think you have a very prescriptive way. It's not maybe prescriptive in the way that the outcomes are, but in terms of the way that you might approach the tool set towards a problem. How does working with a partner or a team change the way that you look at the way that the problem might be resolved?
I'm a huge advocate for collaboration. I think it's a little bit ignorant to think that any one person in their own set ways and in their own set process and in their mind can solve a problem fully, cohesively, and to the highest level that problem can be solved. So some of the best design, whether I've partnered with somebody for some of the competitions, or if I just have some of this on my phone and I talk with some of my colleagues and I'm flipping through the phone and showing them what I'm working on and get some feedback and try and gain that collaboration that way. As long as there's a healthy relationship and you understand each other, then I think collaboration is huge. And then especially if you start to do the cross-disciplinary thing, where they understand tools that you don't, and you understand tools that maybe they don't, and how you can actually compound on that. I think, and I had a conversation with one of the guys here fairly recently about that working through a project with a single set of process it looks like it went through one process. But if you can collaborate and if you can actually start to bring in different tools and maybe tap into other knowledge, and you build whatever portion and then they take it and manipulate it from there and then it comes back, you start to get something that's pretty exciting in a way that no individual tool or no individual person can actually accomplish. And you know, the more you get into a lot of the software and seeing what is generated from each piece of software, the more you're going to be able to just sit back and say, that came from this program, that came from this program, that came from this program, because they're very, they're inclined to want to work a certain way. And so that collaboration from media to media is huge. And I think that's also another comment on the art that I had where it was rusted steel and everything. It was like, how do you take that and then, even though it came from the computer, push it farther so that no single tool or no single process is recognizable in the piece.
Any last questions? I have one more. Yeah, no, this is great stuff. Because I guess, you know, and I'm really trying to provoke maybe some of the things that young students are confronting. So I guess my last question is like, you know, you're a principal or an associate in a practice, but a lot of your work that you brought today is outside of that spectrum. What motivates you, and what, you know, and how do you balance that, you know, the practice of architecture versus the experimentation and the other stuff that you do?
I think the motivation comes from the balance of the two and the influence of one on the other. And I think it's the same reason that I also work in a firm and teach. I love the balance and that relationship of coming here and talking about design problems at a pedagogical level and working through some pretty exciting tools and forms, and then going there and dealing with the reality of building and trying to find some way that this environment can influence that environment, and also how my knowledge there can help in this environment. And I think it's the same thing with my work on some of the more experimental work, trying to figure out how can I get that to start to influence building, or, you know, the built form of architecture in a way that's pretty powerful. So I think both of those in my mind need each other. And I think if I was in make-believe world with a lot of the digital and competition and stuff, I would lose interest, because I do like the tangible result of seeing something built. But also at the other end, you know, I get more excited by some of the experimental, and so I need that to help influence hopefully where the built form goes. Yeah, thanks.
Any last questions? Well, I think this was amazing. I really appreciate you coming.
Good, thank you.
Thanks
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah, thank you guys.